O3b operates a satellite network that's uniquely designed to provide services to the other 3 billion, as the name implies. And that is the approximately 3 billion people in the world who are not connected to the internet. Many of you are probably familiar with O3b, having been, if you've been at PTC in the past, over the last couple of years, O3b has talked about its plans to connect the other 3 billion. But now the company's operational and has 12 satellites in orbit. And so John can now tell us a little bit about the experience the company has had, lessons learned, and how the company is positioned to serve the Pacific region.
Okay. Is that better? Thank you. So I'd like to start out by asking John to give us a 30-second elevator pitch for those of you that might not be familiar with O3b, and tell us how is O3b different from other satellite networks. John?
Thanks, Susan. So in a nutshell, what makes O3b different is we have a different satellite architecture. And the architecture that we have now operating 12 satellites runs at 0 degrees in medium Earth orbit. That's 8,600 kilometers away from Earth. And essentially, that's nearly 5 times closer to Earth than existing satellites. And what that means is that the round-trip latencies of our bandwidth are never more than 150 milliseconds. And compared to the hundreds of megabits, which is the practical limitation of geosynchronous capacity, which is also suffering with several hundred milliseconds of latency, we're able to provide gigabits of capacity. So the combination of low latency and very high bandwidth puts us in the high performance category. And on the same amount of bandwidth supplied compared to fiber, we're virtually identical. In fact, in this region, there's a number of instances where our latencies are actually less than fiber optic because we're not traversing through other fiber optic cables. And so essentially that what makes us different. Second to that, the architecture of the system means that we have manufacturing synergies on our satellites. We don't have to take them so far into space. And as a result, the overall cost of our system is much lower. And so now we have the package, if you will, which is very low cost, high performance bandwidth.
Thanks, John. While you've been building and launching these satellites, there have been some changes that have occurred in the Pacific region. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen in the region over the last couple of years?
Well, the great thing about this region is that we've been part of the changes rather than just standing back and watching them happen. And just to tell you, Susan, the way I joined this company, I got called by Greg Weiler, who's a friend of mine for over 12 years, and he asked me to join the company. And the way he asked me to be persuaded was to go and be part of the very first pitch to Google. And that was a video conference link from Boston to Mountain View. And at the other end of the link was Vint Cerf. So this is in late 2008. And so I sat at the back of the room, and for me, it was a learning as to what O3b was about. And it was the very first pitch to Google from Greg, and he gave the 15 minutes of his life. And quite honestly, Vint Cerf sat fairly disinterested for the first 12 minutes. And then there's a point where he sat bolt upright, and I'll never forget this, and basically said, "This is perfect for the Pacifics." And at that time, I really didn't understand any of the connectivity challenges in the Pacifics, but I started the learning process. And if you remember, in 2009, we came here with Vint Cerf and Greg Weiler, and through 2 separate presentations, we announced the intentions of the company. And at that time, the bandwidth story for the Pacifics was one of being effectively impoverished, right? Very little connectivity, and dealing with effectively a Pacific's population of 2 million, spread over 14 time zones. It just does not lend itself to fiber optic infrastructure, certainly connecting all of the islands and certainly not with redundancy. So you could see the size of the challenge and we could see how we could contribute. Now where we are today is there are 11 Pacific Island nations connected by fiber and there are 11 connected by O3B. So I think the combination of the two technologies sort of closes the book on this first chapter for the Pacifics, where we can say not only is the connectivity largely in place for most of the islands, and I think will be for all of them before long, but the transport network is there and ready for all of the applications that come in the future. And that's the first challenge that had to be solved over the last 5 or 6 years, and I think that's happened.
And how have the customers and potential customers reacted to O3B?
Well, there aren't enough superlatives, to be honest with you, and it's a difficult question to ask in the sense that how do you make the intangible tangible, right? Because we're talking about other people's reactions. But there's a couple of reactions that spring to mind. The first one is we were asked by Royal Caribbean to host their executives on the Oasis and the Allure of the Seas, right? And so each one of these vessels cost more than our entire satellite constellation build to date. They're about $1.4 billion each. So you can imagine the executives on these vessels are very senior individuals. They're dealing with hundreds of millions of onboard revenue, customer experience, crew welfare, so on and so forth. So we brought about 20 executives. It was at the Harris Caprock facility in Miami. We hired a big RV. We got some Android devices, some iPhones, some Apple devices, and some PCs, and we had our link distributed over Wi-Fi. We brought them all into the RV, and on the way they'd hatched a plan to see if they could really test the link. You know, they were going to have FaceTime calls with each other, Skype calls, download large files, etc., etc. So we actually wanted to record the reaction, and they started to get onto the link. We gave them the passwords, and they start to use it. And then what struck me is, for 20 minutes, nothing happened. They didn't say a word. It's as though they forgot the very purpose they were there for, and that's exactly what happens when you have a great connection, you have great bandwidth. You just start doing stuff, right? And this connectivity, as they described it, will change the cruise industry forever. And from their point of view, it's exactly the same as you would have if you were checking into a hotel in New York. Other common popular reactions, particularly in the Pacifics, is numerous times I hear the kids are happy. It seems to be a barometer for bandwidth. We hear CTOs of networks talk about how they brought up the link, and you know, they'll be out somewhere and somebody will walk up to them and say, "What did you do to the network?" And so the reaction really has, across the board, whether you're a consumer, whether you're the operator, the wow factor. And I think it's a watershed moment for satellite connectivity.
And must be pretty gratifying to you.
And relieving as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
and relieving as well. The name of this session is Pacific's Digital Future, Transforming Communities. What new services and applications have you enabled with O3B, and how are they pushing the Pacific region ahead in the digital era?
So the way I look at connectivity, particularly for this region, is it essentially has 3 chapters. And as I mentioned earlier, the first chapter is essentially done, right? Most of the islands have high performance bandwidth. And the second chapter is much shorter to complete, which is the distribution of that bandwidth. So broadband wireless access networks, 3G networks, HSDPA, 4G. The ability to deploy those networks is now in the hands of those operators. But the good news is the ecosystem is very, very mature. So even though you come in late, you can deploy it very quickly. The applications are there, the handset costs have been driven down, the networks are available and they're ready, and so they're quick to deploy. So before very long, what we'll see is most, if not all, of the islands deploying 3G services. And of course, the benefits of doing that are obvious, particularly as we move through the next 10 years, almost everything we do will be exclusively mobile. So then you get to the third chapter in the book, which is what do you do with it when you have it, right? And how do you get those productivity gains? And that's where we'll see the Internet of Things being, frankly, the only thing we'll be talking about for the next 5 years, because it brings with it a set of opportunities for everyone, but it also brings challenges for the operators to carry the bandwidth that comes along with that.
So with O3B enabling internet connections to the world, the part of the world that doesn't have it now, what do you see, how do you envision the internet looking in the next 5 years?
So it's one of those things where, to my mind, in answering the question, you have to take stock of where you've come from. And so at the application level, if you think back to when we announced our intentions at PTC'15, you know, Android wasn't even released then. There was something like 50 million subscribers on Facebook. The Dropbox, Boxnet, these applications, Pinterest, WhatsApp, which has since been sold for 16, 20 billion, I can't remember what it is, didn't even exist, right? So the entire world changed right under our feet in just that time period. And we couldn't have imagined what we would have been using when we were talking in 2009. But we were telling the right story, which is that the transport network had to be ready for that unknown future. Now, the change ahead of us is the Internet of Things, which really should be called the Internet of Things and Humans, because it's the interaction between sensors, actuators, networks, humans, intelligence, and user interfaces. And unfortunately, not all of the applications that are created, the operators themselves are going to generate revenue from. They effectively become over-the-top services that eat up bandwidth and not necessarily increase the wallet share of the consumers. So the next challenge for the operators will be how to get to deliver the bandwidth at the lowest cost, but with the performance you need for those applications.
So if you're a Pacific Islander and you're evaluating O3B versus fiber versus all the other satellite and non-satellite transmission services, what are the criteria that you would use to make your determination?
Well, you choose O3B every time, Susan.
Well, of course you would, but...
So the real answer to the question is, for this region at least, is you have to be very realistic about the take-up of demand, the population that you're serving, the reach, which in the case of the Pacific often means not just talking about the main islands, but also talking about the outer islands. So what you don't want to do, of course, is to be caught in the trap, for example, of delivering fiber to the main island and meeting expectations there, but raising false hope everywhere else, where to the outer islands, part of the same nation that can't be reached. So the idea is either with a combination of fiber and our capacity or with our capacity, is to make sure that the entire Pacific nation in question gets access to the same bandwidth in the same way and roughly on the same price benchmark. And then you have this very specific Pacific question of reach and architecture, because unfortunately the topology of the Pacific Islands doesn't lend itself too well to fiber, and that's why the fiber routes that some would like to see don't exist, and that's been a story for a long time. But if they did exist, the next question would be the reliability and what actually happens when such a long cable breaks. In our case, the expression we use is we like to bring the milk to the doorstep, right? We bring the bandwidth right to the heart of the network and to the outer islands. And so obviously there are very strong cases for fiber in very highly populous countries, and there are some in the Pacifics. And there are some in the middle ground, if you like, where we tend to dominate. And then there are the very, very remote and micro communities where I think there is space for other high throughput systems or broadband satellites.
And what about the satellite innovations that are available, that are being developed? What are the most significant innovations that will have an impact on the Pacific region?
So I think the question is, what are you trying to accomplish? And Pat Wong from Comtech talked about a good put the other day, which is making sure that you deliver the quality of service and the quality of experience at the lowest cost per bit. And that is always the name of the game for any bandwidth provider. And so what you have to do is look at the whole ecosystem as a package, and anything that brings down the cost but improves the performance. So obviously on the launch side, you see SpaceX with the reusable rocket, and they're so close now that I think everybody expects that to happen. You have obviously electric propulsion on satellites. You have new architectures such as our own, and we're contemplating another next generation design. And then on the ground, of course, you have some great innovation. One that springs to mind for me is Keynote, right, which is breaking all of the rules with respect to either tracking moving satellites from a fixed position or tracking fixed or moving satellites from a mobile platform, and doing it electronically and with no moving parts, which, as you can imagine, is of great interest to us.
Well, thank you, John. I think we've run out of time.